Well, thank you all very much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'd like to talk about an opportunity for us to be involved in a collaborative approach to climate leadership. And I'd like to just go over a few things with you. What I hope to talk about today is first, I'd like to present an alternate view of the climate problem. I'd like to talk about different ways we can interact with the world and introduce this idea of regenerative thinking. I'd also like to talk about 4 key points or 4 areas that I think we could all be working on about starting our journey, leading by example, the way we communicate issues related to climate change, and then the opportunity we have to engage our visitors. And then finally, I'd like to talk about the Climate Toolkit, which is a collaborative effort for cultural organizations to address climate change, and then close by inviting you to join us in participating in the toolkit. Just to help you, let's see how do I do this. You know where we're coming from. I work at Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Garden. Our original conservatory opened in 1893. We're located in the northeast section of the United States in the city of Pittsburgh. Last November, I spoke at the COP26 meeting that was held in Glasgow. And in attending that meeting, one of the things that struck me was, first of all, how few botanical gardens and other cultural organizations were represented at the meeting. But also, I was really surprised with the major emphasis to be this top-down approach to addressing climate change, and there was really no consideration for the potential, the momentum that could be generated from a bottom-up approach to addressing climate change. Now, I don't think either a top-down or a bottom-only approach to climate change is going to be successful. I think we really need to do both. Is there some feedback coming through? No? Okay.
It's all right, I got it.
Okay, great. So I think it's really important that we recognize that there's a tremendous opportunity to do both a top-down approach to climate change and a bottom-up approach to addressing climate change. Now, if we look at the current situation in the world right now, one of the things, there's a lot of studies and there's a lot of statistics to demonstrate this, that we're greatly exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet to support human and other forms of life, which means that essentially we're stealing from future generations to be able to provide for themselves. And what that looks like now is when we think about our unsustainable use of natural resources, it's leading to such problems as climate change, habitat destruction, loss of biodiversity, environmental racism, and global inequities. But these are really not the problem. These are the symptom of the problem. The real problem is the lifestyles we lead, which is leading to such things that you see here. Now, I know in botanical gardens, there are a lot of us that are doing a lot of very important work in addressing things like loss of species, endangered species, habitats, protecting endangered habitats, and many other types of activities that we're all involved in. And I know through the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens, there's a lot of important work going on about how do we make sure that our gardens and our collections are going to survive in the future as climate change progresses. But I do think it's important for us to recognize that we have a strong suit here, and the strong suit is the opportunity, or the fact that we work with plants, and the opportunity that we have to connect people to plants and to connect people to nature. I think this is really critical, and this is something we can really focus on in getting people to think about how they interact with the world and take it from a plant's point of view. Now, it's really interesting to me, back in October of 2018, the Stockholm Resilience Center came out with this report called Transformation That's Feasible. And the basis of this report was to focus on the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And they said, there's a lot of people that are interested in addressing these goals. There's a lot of, whether it be individuals, organizations, governments, institutions, that are really interested in trying to figure out how can we accomplish as many of these goals as possible. But the basis of this study was that nobody's really looked at how we're going to accomplish them. So they decided to model 4 different ways of how we could address the Sustainable Development Goals. And they modeled them out to the year of 2050. And the first model they looked at was called SAME, which was business as usual. Let's just keep doing things the way we're doing them now. The second model they looked at was called FASTER, where they said, let's just focus on really ramping up gross domestic product around the world. Let's generate lots of money so that we can actually have a lot of money to put towards problems such as the Sustainable Development Goals. The third model they looked at was called HARDER. They said, let's just focus on putting a lot of our efforts and energy into addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. And the fourth model they looked at was called SMARTER. And in this model, they said, we have to completely throw out the way we've been doing things in the past. We have to take a bold, transformational look at how we're doing things and completely change the way we think about how we interact with the world. Now, the interesting thing is, when they modeled this out to the year 2050, they found that actually the SMARTER, or the bold transformational policies, actually allowed us to achieve the highest number of Sustainable Development Goals. But what's really interesting is that when they looked at the effect on the planet, they found that only the SMARTER policies actually kept us out of crossing the red zone of planetary distress. As a matter of fact, it actually started to reverse some of the damage that we've been doing to the planet, whereas the other three models put us below the red line for planetary distress. So when we talk about transformation, what exactly are we talking about? Well, I think one of the ways that we look at transformation is from a regenerative point of view. And probably the best example I've heard of thinking from a regenerative point of view is based on the work that was done by Carol Sanford. And I particularly like this model that she came up with called 4 different paradigms of how we can interact with the world. And the first model is called the extractive model. And in this model, people see the world as fragments, there for the taking. And it's all about me. I'm going to take what I can get. And a lot of times people either don't know about or they don't care about who they hurt or what they hurt in the process. This is the basis of many of the economies in the world right now, is this extractive model. And if you take this to the extreme, obviously you get to such things such as colonialism. The next model she talks about is called the less bad model. And in this model, people still see the world as fragments, but now they're trying to stabilize them. And it's not just about me anymore, it's about us, and we're starting to see some interconnectedness. And we're trying to be less bad, trying to do less damage. And if you think about it, this is where the environmental movement started back in the 70s. If you think about this idea of let's reduce, reuse, recycle, let's try and be less bad. The third model she talks about is called the do good model. In this model, we still see the world as fragments, but now we're trying to improve them. And it's not about me anymore, it's about us, it's about reciprocity, it's trying to reverse some of the damage that we're doing. Now, this model, you might think, well, this is a really good model. Why are we all following a do good model? Well, there is one fundamental problem with the do good model. It's based on the idea that somebody somewhere decides what's good and then tries to impose that idea of what's good on everyone else. And nobody likes to be told what to do. The fourth model is called a regenerative model. And in this model, people don't see the world as fragments, they see it as whole. And it's not about me anymore, it's about us. And it's all about relationships. And it's recognizing that everyone and everything is connected on the planet. And we try to really understand what is the relationship we have with everyone else and everything else, and how do we improve that relationship? And how do we fit in, and how do we make sure that we're doing something that's good for everyone and everything? And this, you know, it's recognizing that we live within nested systems, that everything's connected. And this is how a lot of indigenous people around the world think from this regenerative point of view about this idea of relationships. And I guess I would just like to ask you, before I go any further, to think about where on this set of 4 paradigms do you think you are, or where do you think your institution is, and where would you like it to be? I know at Phipps, we're striving to really focus on this regenerative idea and really emphasize this in everything that we do at the conservatory and our gardens. And Carol goes on to talk about 7 principles of regenerative thinking, and there's 4 of them that I'd really like to just focus on for a few minutes right now. The first is this idea of essence, and recognize that every living being is unique, and whether it be an individual, every species, every individual within a species, everyone and everything is unique. The second idea is this idea of nestedness, and understand that we exist in we're embedded in larger and lesser systems. The fourth is this idea of reciprocity and recognizing that we operate within living dynamic systems where exchanges need to be mutually beneficial. And the fourth is this idea of development, where everything that we do is to try to increase the capacity of everyone to be vital and viable based on their own individual essence. And this is some of the things that we try to emphasize in the work that we do at the Conservatory. And to help us do that, we actually use a couple of different frameworks that I'd just like to share a few of them with you. The first is this idea of living system stakeholders. And in this framework, we recognize that in everything that we do, that we have a number of different stakeholders that we need to address. Now, if you think of a typical business or even a typical organization, whether it be whether you're a nonprofit or an NGO, or you're a state institution, or you're associated with a university, we all have investors or donors or people that are really responsible for providing the funds for our being to exist. In this case, we call our investors. Now, most companies, businesses, organizations obviously put a lot of focus on making sure that they address the needs of their investors. Some companies, some organizations also focus on their users. Some others might actually also focus on their community. Very few would actually go towards focusing on their co-creators, which is their staff, their suppliers, their volunteers. And then the fifth stakeholder is the planet Earth. In regenerative thinking, we try to make sure that we address all five stakeholders equally in everything that we do. So we don't just focus on one or two or three of these. We really try to make sure that we're adding value to all five stakeholders all the time in everything we do. Another model that we'd like to use is called the 3 lines of work. And in this model, we say, okay, we have our person or staff member in the center, the self. We try to make sure they're proficient in everything that they're doing, that they can do in their jobs, that they were trained to do. But we also try to get them to think the next level out in the organization and get out of their silo and recognize that the organization has a number of different things that we want our organization to accomplish, and that they can play a very important role in helping our organization be successful. But then we also take it out to the 3rd line and we try to understand what is the effect on the whole, in this case, of our community, and how can we be more effective in addressing what is really important for our community to try to achieve, and how can we help our community evolve to be better. So in 3 lines of work, we're always trying to get people to think to that 3rd line and try to understand what is the ultimate goal of what we're trying to achieve. Another area that we'd like to focus on is about taking a long-term view. I think many of us in our organizations, we tend to focus on short-term results. We tend to focus on, particularly when we're doing building projects, we try to look at what is the return on investment, how can we do things as cheaply as we possibly can. We really focus on first costs, and we really don't understand the impact of what we're doing on future generations. So it's really important for us, I think, to start taking a long-term view in the things that we do as well. An example I'd like to show is based on the study that was done in 2002 by the Packard Foundation. And in this study, they looked at what the cost difference was between building a market rate building and a living building challenge building. Now, a living building challenge is the most rigorous green building standard in the world that you can possibly build, and it's actually more expensive than a market rate building. And if you look at the cost differentials here, now let me just back up for a second and just say this was done in 2002. This is over 20 years ago, when the cost of building a green building was substantially more expensive than a traditional building. Those cost differentials come way down. The other thing I'd like to just mention is I recognize that everybody is coming from, different abilities and financial capacity right now. So really don't want to use this so much to talk about finances. What I'm really trying to do is show what the impact is of long-term thinking. So in this particular case, based on this study from 2002, they looked at the difference in the building a market rate building compared to a living building. And you could see the upfront costs, there's a difference of about $4 million. But if you look at what the cost of operating that building is over 30, 60, 100 years, you can see that there is a huge difference in building a traditional building compared to a living building challenge building. the cost of operating a market rate building over the next 100 years is going to be over $348 million, compared to the cost of operating a living building, which would be about $20 million over 100 years. Now, I won't be around 100 years from now to see the impact of the work that I'm doing right now, but I think it's important, and I think all of us need to be thinking about what is the impact of what we're doing now going to have on future generations that are running our gardens when we do things and when we make decisions. In this case, if I was in this example here, I would much rather know that my organization was taking that extra $328 million over the next 100 years and investing it in programs for my community rather than using it as money to operate their building. So just an example here, not so much focused on the actual dollars I'm talking about, but really just to talk about this idea of really thinking what the impact is over the long term. And when you start to combine this idea of long-term thinking with regenerative thinking and starting to look at how do you address all your stakeholders, you can see that it can have a profound impact on the work that you're able to accomplish in your organization. So here's an example of some of the things that we've been able to accomplish at Phipps since 2005, based on this different way of measuring success and different way about thinking. So going back to 2005, when we switched to 100% renewable energy for our entire campus. A couple of examples: 2006, getting rid of all the plastic disposable serviceware. 2009, getting rid of bottled water. 2010, we began to offset all the carbon that we used to heat all of our buildings with carbon offsets. In 2012, we built our first zero energy building. In 2015, we built our second zero energy building. We divested from fossil fuel investments. In 2017, we switched to environmental ESG, sustainable, socially responsible investments. 2018 was our third zero energy building. Now we're doing things like really focused on reducing our fossil fuel steam heating and switching our cafe to things where it's mostly vegetarian and vegan type of menu. So again, these are things that are a lot easier when you completely change the focus of what it is that you're doing. And it leads me to really want to emphasize 4 different things that I think are critical right now. The first is, no matter where you are, it's really important to start your journey. You have to start somewhere, and start doing something, and then try to learn as much as you can to continue that growth and to continue on that journey. The second is to really use this as an opportunity to lead by example. So here's a building that Tessa mentioned earlier. Some of the work that we've done, this is called our Center for Sustainable Landscapes. It's our education, administration, and research building. It was opened in 2012. It's still the only building in the world to have met all of these certifications, which are based on maximizing human and environmental and the health for the landscape. It's really, to me, is an example of what good looks like. And I think this is what we need to show people, that it is actually possible to do some of these things now. This building was built, there's no rocket science in this building, it was all done with off-the-shelf technology. And it really gives us an opportunity to show people that it is possible to live in a way that's better for people and for the planet. That's something that I think the environmental movement got wrong very early on when it started back in the 1970s, where we started to make people feel like that if you wanted to be sustainable, if you wanted to do something that was green, you had to give things up, and you might as well just get used to it. You're going to be miserable and uncomfortable. Well, nobody aspires to be uncomfortable. If we want people to change the way they live, we actually have to show them it's better, and it's possible to do that. And I think botanical gardens provide us an excellent opportunity to do that. I also think we need to think about how we communicate some of the issues. I think a good example here is when we talk about climate change, we talk about tons of CO2. Who knows what a ton of CO2 looks like? I don't know anybody who does. So we have to start thinking about how can we put this in a way that people can understand it. Now, the typical Pennsylvania household where I'm from creates about 7 tons of carbon dioxide a year to power their home. Well, that's the equivalent of burning 16 barrels of oil. So we lined our front walkway with 16 oil barrels to demonstrate to people that if you were to burn all these barrels of oil, That's how much carbon dioxide you'd be putting into the air each year from powering your home. This was a really important and effective way of getting people to understand what their impact is on climate change. The result of that is it led us to create a way to engage our visitors and switch in the way they live. We created a green power drive where we teamed up with a green electricity provider to provide incentives for people to switch to green electricity. And over the past couple of years, we've gotten over 6,500 families to switch to green electricity while visiting Phipps. That's the equivalent of not burning over 100,000 barrels of oil each year. So again, here's an opportunity I think we all have to really start to engage the people that visit our gardens, to think about how they're living and how they can do things in a more sustainable way. And I think it comes down to this idea of plants and getting people excited about plants, getting people excited about nature, that we're a perfect venue to start getting people to start thinking about ways that they can do things differently. When we think about things like climate change, I think it's important to recognize that there are both downstream and upstream components of the problem. Downstream, making sure we're saving species, we're saving habitats, that we're preparing our gardens through work that's being done by the Alliance to survive the inevitable effects of climate change. But I also think there are upstream opportunities as well to do everything we can to prevent the worst aspects of climate change happening. And that is something that I think is really critical. And I think, there are lots of examples around the world. Probably one of the more better examples right now is what's happened in the rainforest, where we see a lot of the rainforest being cut down or burned in order to produce cattle, so that people can have access to inexpensive meat. We also see the same thing with things like the rainforest being cut down for producing soy, whether it be for cattle food, for actual human consumption. This is something that's being driven by a demand for meat and soy. And so it's a lifestyle issue. It's an issue where unless we do something about the demand, we're going to continue to see problems like this where habitats and species are going to be in danger because of the insatiable desire we have for things like cheap meat. So this gives us, I think, a really great opportunity in the garden, museums, whether it's zoos or aquaria, to think about the aspect that we are collectively some of the most trusted organizations in each of our communities. And we reach hundreds of millions of people a year that visit our gardens, whether our other zoos, aquarium, museums around the world. And we have a tremendous opportunity to inspire people to think about how they live and to think about changing the way they live. And that was the basis for our working with some other gardens to create the Climate Toolkit as an opportunity for gardens to share, mentor, and learn from each other. I mean, there's no reason why we should be reinventing the wheel. We have an opportunity to share what we're doing with each other, learn from each other, and then use that as an example to inspire our members and our visitors to think about things that they can do as well. Climate change is not going to be solved only through a top-down approach. It's not going to be solved only through a bottom-up approach. It's going to be a combination, and I think we can play a really critical role in developing that bottom-up approach to addressing climate change. And when we first started the toolkit, we identified all these particular areas that we thought that gardens could really be effective in addressing climate change. And I have to admit, when we first started this, we originally approached this from a do-good point of view. And we said, these are things that everybody should be doing. Well, it turns out nobody likes to be told what to do. And we really then decided that we really need to take a regenerative approach. And we really needed to give everyone the opportunity to understand what is unique about their garden, what is unique about their community, where does it make the most sense for them to be working, how can they work to maximize the potential of their individual garden and their community to actually increase the capacity of themselves and their community to actually be better in addressing climate change. And once we switched to that model of thinking, we saw a substantial increase in the number of organizations that have become members of the toolkit. Now we have 62 organizations from around the world. that have joined the toolkit, that are sharing information with each other, sharing ways that they can be addressing climate change, using this as an opportunity to get their individuals, their communities involved. And of those 62, actually 42 of them are gardens. That most of them in the United States, but we do have some from around the world. In the United Kingdom, we have the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, Royal Botanic Gardens at Edinburgh. In Canada, we have the Montreal Botanical Garden. In the United States, we have the New York Botanical Garden, the Denver Botanical Garden, the Smithsonian Institution, and a number of other organizations as well. And we really would like to continue to grow this collaboration between all these different gardens to really start sharing things, ways that we can address climate change. And the way the toolkit is set up right now, it allows you to sort by all these different attributes. So say you're in an area where it's really important for you to be addressing energy. Well, you can sort by energy and find out all the other institutions that are doing work to address energy and see if any of them are doing anything that might make sense for where you are. Same thing with water. You can do the same thing with food service. You know, which organizations are successful in switching over to things like vegetarian and vegan foods. You know, in their cafes, getting rid of plastic disposables. Single-use plastic disposables, things like that, getting rid of bottled water. There's lots of different opportunities here to really see what other people are doing and learn from what they've done. How did they get their staff involved? How did they convince their boards or the people that they're reporting to that this is an important thing that we should be doing? There's a great opportunity here for all of us to be sharing this kind of work. You can look at things like landscape and horticulture. How can we make the way we operate our gardens be more efficient and less energy intensive? We can also do things like transportation. Can we incentivize our staff? Can we incentivize our visitors to take more sustainable ways of getting to our gardens? And in investments, those of us with endowments or have some investments, how can we invest them in things that are not related to fossil fuels or other areas where we think it's important that we either support or not support? And then there are things like internal and external engagement. How do we get our staff and our boards excited about this work? How can we get our communities involved in addressing this work as well? And then research. How can we, focus on the research that's really important in our community to address climate change? And, let's look at what other institutions have done, see if there's anything that we can learn from them to do this as well. So that's really the main basis of the toolkit right now. It is you can sort by these different areas as the number of institutions join the toolkit. We'll be creating ways for people to sort by bioregion, by different types of, whether you're a garden, a museum, a zoo, you'll be able to sort by things like that, by country or state. There'll be lots of different ways so that we'll be able to create opportunities for you to find people who are in similar situations as you. So really you can focus in on what's really important and things that you can really focus on. We also have a webinar series that we're doing, sharing different ways that people are addressing climate change. We have a blog, we have a listserv. We're in the process right now of developing some workshops, introductory workshops to regenerative thinking that I know a number of different gardens have said they'd be interested in learning more about regenerative thinking. So we want to help people with that. This past year, we did a pilot study where we created a youth advisory climate committee where we want to support young people and their initiatives in addressing climate change. And the idea here is to think about how can we get young people involved? These are our future members. These are our future donors. These are people that are going to be really important to the future of our gardens. How can we show them that we care about what's really important to them, what's relevant to them, that's really going to affect their lives in the future? We want to be important players in this area. We want to support them. The idea here is this next year, we'll be farming this out to several other gardens to get them and help them get their young people engaged in addressing climate change. And then the idea is to link these youth from all these different gardens and museums from around the world so that they can start sharing ideas with each other as well as through the Climate Toolkit. So I think there's this tremendous opportunity here. I think no matter where you are, or on this, in your sustainability journey. There's lots of opportunities to do things to change, and things that you wouldn't think were possible, I think are possible. I look at our own situation. When our original conservatory opened in 1893, we built what was probably, which I consider to be one of the best examples of the worst kinds of buildings you could possibly build. A single pane glass house designed to grow tropical plants in a temperate climate. And then on the very same campus, we have some of the greenest buildings in the world. So I think there is an opportunity here for us to think about changing the past and thinking about the future. And with that in mind, I think, I'd like to close by just encouraging you to start thinking regeneratively, think about relationships, start thinking about the lifestyle issues that are resulting in such things as climate change. Look at the opportunities there are for you to lead by example in your community. Think about working collaboratively, whether it be through the toolkit or other ways to share, mentor, and learn from each other, and support a bottom-up approach to climate change. Because I'd like to go back to this one slide that I started out with this with the climate conference that was held in Glasgow last year. We need to show people that we care about climate change, that we are important players, that we can make a difference. We can really generate that bottom-up support for getting drastic or dramatic changes in the way we live in the world. And I think whether it be through the toolkit, have a number of people join the toolkit, or some other way, I think it's really important for us to come together and show the world that we are important players in this effort. So I'd like to encourage all of you to join the toolkit. I do have some links to further information that I could provide people with later on. But the bottom line here is to join the toolkit. Actually, let me just say a few things about this. So we do have a website, theclimatetoolkit.org. If you're interested in more information about Phipps, I did give a TED talk about some of the work that we're doing. We have information on our own website about green healthy spaces and the green power drive. There's also a link to that on our website as well. And if you're interested in learning more about regenerative thinking, there's a book, Indirect Work by Carol Sanford, that I think is really good as well. So lots of opportunities here, and I hope that you will think about joining us in being a part of this effort and joining the Climate Toolkit. So thank you all very much. Be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. That was really inspiring and invigorating. Very much appreciated it. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask Richard, feel free to come off mute and step in and ask, or you can put your questions in chat. I'll just kick off with a quick small question. Have you had any sort of feedback or reach out from much smaller regional gardens or gardens that are run purely by volunteers and have, strictly speaking, no budget to speak of? Do you have any sort of case studies about those smaller gardens?
If you look on our on the website, climatetoolkit.org, there are some gardens that are smaller gardens that are part of this effort. I think, everybody has different capacity, but everybody can be doing something, I think. And there are ways, even without a lot of funding available, that you can start to make a significant impact on climate change. And the toolkit will allow you to identify some of those other smaller gardens, to find people that are in the same situation as you, to be able to start sharing things as well. So it's not just for big gardens. I think we want to make an opportunity for everyone to have an opportunity to identify other organizations that are in similar situations as them, so they can start sharing and learning from each other.
Yeah, fantastic. Quick question from Claire. Do you know how other organizations or gardens generally rate themselves? Is that, Claire, is that in regards to the do good, less bad, regenerative thing, or? Oh, you're on mute, Claire.
Still on mute.
Sorry, Claire, you're on mute. Right, that was a yes. So when organizations first sign up, do you have an idea of if they generally see themselves as being less bad or do good, that sort of thing?
Well, we try to shy away from that because I think that discourages people if they
Mm,
feel like they're in a competition with each other. The idea here is not to say somebody's better than the other. It's to recognize that everyone is in a different stage in their journey. And the idea here is to just start. And even if you start with one item, the idea here is to find out what other people are doing and learn from them so you can keep adding new things to what you're doing.
yeah, absolutely. I've spent the last few days editing the Landscape Succession Toolkit, which the Alliance is going to launch at the Congress in September, which is, of course, focusing mostly on climate adaptation for the landscapes and the living collections. But what I was struck here with how much similarity there is in talking about thinking in terms of the long term and thinking in terms of holistically, and especially about collaboration and relationships. Like both the Climate Toolkit and the Landscape Succession Toolkit both focus on a need to sort of change the way that we think before we can really understand what the right action to take is. Claire has another question.
Yes.
And also,
on behavior change, we actually have, our research department has actually done some behavioral change studies. They actually just published some. I can get that information to you. I'd be happy to share that with you. I don't know it off the top of my head though.
okay. Giuseppe, I see your hand up. Did you want to come off mute and ask a question? Go for it.
Thank you, Tessa. And Richard, great presentation. Really like that. I'm passionate about sustainability in particular because I work here in Melbourne organization where sustainability is really one of our strongest areas. I just got a question related with some of that big greenhouses I've seen behind the building. The question is, at the time of the design, what would be or would have been taken into consideration in terms of energy rating for that particular, or when it comes to a greenhouse? Will you rate that building as extremely sustainable, energy rating, everything? And if yes, will that compromise the variety of collection of plants that you have into that?
Okay, I think I understand your question, Giuseppe, in that you're asking if, as we make our greenhouses more sustainable, will it have an impact on our ability to grow plants? Is that fair?
Correct, yeah, and because creating a closed environment greenhouse obviously requires some certain level of manipulation and climate conditions. So,
right.
Does it, how was for you? That.
Well, that's a really good question. There's a couple of things here. One is history. I know we have a historical old conservatory, and we're bound to make sure that we don't detract from the historical nature of the conservatory. So that limits a lot of what we can do on the building. The second area, which I think you were alluding to, is the fact that we need to make sure that we can grow our plants the best that they can possibly be, and we provide the ideal conditions for them, which is not always compatible with having the most energy efficient type of space. So we tend to lean towards the making sure we can grow plants well, and then finding other ways to address the fact that the building is not going to be as sustainable as it can be. So for example, I don't think we're going to find ourselves with a 100% zero energy conservatory, because to do something like that would really impact the way we're able to grow plants. So we try to build a building that's as efficient as we can. We have a number of different things that we've done in our conservatories and glass houses to make them better and more efficient. And then we do things to offset whatever energy we do need. We try to make sure that it's as green as possible. So this year I mentioned that we're cutting 42% of our fossil fuel use for our old conservatory spaces. We're switching to heat pumps, electric heat pumps, which are a lot more efficient than burning fossil fuels for heating those buildings. And then we'll be using renewable energy to power those heat pumps. So the buildings will actually be powered by essentially solar energy. So it's a trade-off. and we need to make sure that we can grow our plants well. I mean, that's a critical thing that we want to make sure that we do.
Remarkable, really, really well, very good. Thank you so much for you.
Okay.
All right. Has anybody else got any questions they want to throw out in the last second? All good. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for presenting, Richard. That was brilliant. I've dropped the link to the Climate Toolkit into the chat, as well as a link I found to Richard's TED talk. I couldn't quite remember the other resources you mentioned. I'm sorry about that. But this, of course, has been recorded and will go up on the Alliance website later on. I'll have to do something about putting in an extra introduction for not failing to record that. Thank you everybody for turning up. We've crossed many time zones for this particular meeting. So thank you all for turning up. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night for us in Australia. And I hope you have a fantastic day, all of you.
And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.
Brilliant. I think we
Richard.
definitely
Thanks,
will.
Tessa.
No worries. Thanks, everyone.